The cafe was always quiet in the mornings, and that was exactly how she liked it. The smell of roasted beans, the soft hum of the coffee machine, and the faint music playing in the background were enough to make her feel safe. It was her small world, peaceful, familiar, and far away from everything that had once hurt her. Every morning, she came in at the same time. 7:45. Always the same corner seat by the window. Always the same order. A cappuccino with 1 spoon of sugar. The waitress didn't even need to ask anymore. It was routine, and in that routine she found comfort. She had been coming here for almost a year now. The staff knew her as the quiet one. She smiled politely, said thank you softly, and then disappeared behind her book or her thoughts. She wasn't lonely by choice, but being alone was easier than trusting people again. Her name was Elena. She worked as a book editor for a small publishing house nearby. Her job was quiet too, reading, correcting, and polishing words that belonged to other people. Maybe that was why she liked it so much. Words were safe. People weren't. That morning, the air outside was cold and the streets were still half asleep. She walked with her scarf pulled up, her gloved hands holding a worn-out notebook. The cafe lights glowed warmly through the fogged glass, and she smiled faintly before walking in. "Good morning." "Miss Russo," said the barista, smiling. "Good morning," she replied softly, taking off her gloves. Her seat, the one in the corner, and was empty just as she liked it. She sat down, opened her notebook, and wrote something small. Another quiet morning. But that morning was different, even if she didn't know it yet. When the waitress came with her usual cup, she hesitated for the first time. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I think someone asked to reserve this table today." Elena looked up, confused. "Reserve it? Since when do we reserve tables here?" The waitress shrugged apologetically. "I know, but the owner said we should. I can move you to another seat if you'd like." Elena looked around. The other tables were fine, but this one was hers. She had spent almost a year watching the world through the same window, tracing the same streak of light that fell across the glass. It felt strange to move. "I'll just stay until whoever it is arrives," she said with a small smile. "If they ask me to move, I will." The waitress nodded and left, clearly uneasy. Elena opened her book and tried to read, but the page didn't hold her attention. Something about the air felt different, heavier maybe. She brushed it off as her imagination. 10 minutes passed before the cafe door opened again. The bell above it gave a soft ring and a man stepped in. He wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to see there. Most of the regular customers were office workers or students. He was neither. He walked slowly, calmly, with a sort of quiet authority that made people look up without knowing why. He wore a dark overcoat, perfectly tailored. His shoes shone, but not in a flashy way, more like someone who believed in discipline. His hair was neatly combed back, a few streaks of silver at the sides. His face looked calm, but there was something sharp behind his eyes, something that made people instinctively step aside. The cafe went silent for a moment. Even the owner glanced up from the counter and straightened his posture. Elena didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on her book, pretending not to feel the shift in the room. The man looked around once, then walked straight toward her table, the one in the corner. Without asking, without hesitation, he sat down in the empty chair across from her. Elena froze, her fingers tightening around her cup. She looked up slowly. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I think this table might be yours." He smiled faintly. "It is now," he said. His voice was deep, calm, and unhurried, like someone who didn't need to prove himself. "I can move if you'd like," she offered politely. "No need," he said, waving a hand. "Finish your coffee." His tone wasn't rude. It was strange, uncommanding, but oddly gentle, like someone who was used to being obeyed without question. Elena hesitated. The man leaned back, studying her with quiet interest. "You always sit here," he said. She blinked. "You've seen me before?" He nodded once. "Every morning for months." Her heartbeat quickened. She wasn't sure what to say. "That's strange to notice," she said softly. He smiled, not offended. "Not strange if you notice the same things I do. Some people become part of a place without realizing it." The waitress brought another cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and set it in front of him. She didn't ask what he wanted. She already knew. Elena noticed the way her hands trembled slightly. The man thanked her and looked back at Elena. "Do you know what I think?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I think peace is dangerous. It makes you forget you're still living." Elena frowned. "I like peace." He smiled again as if he expected that answer. "I know, that's why I'm here." She didn't understand. "I'm sorry, I don't know who you are." He looked into her eyes for a moment, then said quietly, "From this sip, you're my wife." The words hit her like cold water. She almost laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his expression didn't change. I'm sorry, what?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward slightly. "You heard me." Elena looked around, half expecting someone to tell her this was a prank. But no one did. In fact, everyone else in the cafe seemed to be pretending not to look. Too focused on their cups, their phones, anything but the man sitting across from her. The owner stood near the counter, eyes lowered, hands folded. He didn't say a word. Elena's throat went dry. "I don't know who you think I am," she said carefully, "but I think you're mistaken." He tilted his head slightly as if he found her reaction interesting. "Mistaken? No, I don't make mistakes about people." She tried to laugh again to lighten the moment, but it came out shaky. "Well, then I must be the exception." His gaze softened slightly. "You look afraid." "I'm not," she lied. "Yes, you are," he said calmly. "But you don't need to be." She didn't reply. After a few seconds, he stood up, leaving his untouched coffee on the table. "Drink your cappuccino," he said quietly. "Don't let it get cold." Then he turned and walked out. Elena sat there, frozen. Her heart was still racing, her hands still trembling around the cup. The waitress approached slowly. "Are you okay?" she asked in a whisper. Elena looked up, confused. "Who was that?" The waitress glanced at the door, then shook her head quickly. "Don't ask, just be careful." That made it worse. Elena spent the rest of her morning in silence. She couldn't read. She couldn't write. She just sat there, staring at the coffee he'd left untouched. When she finally stood to leave, she noticed something on the table, a small business card under her napkin. It had no name, no phone number. Just a symbol, a gold ring drawn in a circle and two initials printed beneath it, VD. She frowned. The letters meant nothing to her. She folded the card and slipped it into her notebook without thinking. Outside, the streets were louder now. The sun had climbed higher, melting the last bits of morning fog. But for the first time in a long while, Elena didn't feel the comfort of her routine. She walked toward her office, but her mind was somewhere else, back in that cafe. Back at that moment when a stranger sat down and said words that didn't make sense, but somehow felt impossible to forget. She didn't know that her quiet mornings were over. That from this day on, her life would no longer belong only to her. She only knew that the next time she'd lift a cup of coffee to her lips, she'd hesitate, wondering who might be watching from across the room. The next morning, she almost didn't go to the cafe. She had woken up early as usual, but her mind wouldn't stop replaying what had happened the day before. That strange man, his calm eyes, the way everyone else in the cafe seemed afraid of him, and those words he said, "From this sip, you're my wife." It sounded crazy, but the look on his face wasn't a joke. She told herself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd confused her with someone else. Maybe he was joking in some old-fashioned way she didn't understand. Either way, she had no reason to see him again. Still, when she stepped outside, her feet somehow led her in the same direction, toward the cafe. Maybe she wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't scared, that she still had control over her own routine. When she walked in, the place looked exactly the same. Warm lights, smell of coffee, soft chatter. But something was different. The owner greeted her with a polite nod, his eyes careful, almost protective. "Good morning," she said quietly. He smiled nervously. "Morning, Miss Russo, your usual seat?" She hesitated, then nodded. The waitress brought her cappuccino like always, but her hands shook slightly as she set it down. "If anything feels strange today," she whispered, "just call me, okay?" Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" The waitress didn't answer. She just gave a small smile and walked away. Elena sighed and opened her book, pretending to read. She told herself it was fine. The man was gone. It was over. But 10 minutes later, the door opened, and her heart sank. He was back. He walked in with the same calm confidence, wearing a dark suit this time. No coat, no rush. Just that same air of quiet power that made everyone else seem smaller. He looked around once and spotted her immediately. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen him. But she couldn't. He walked straight toward her table again, and before she could say a word, he sat down across from her, the same seat as before. Elena took a deep breath. "You're sitting here again," she said. He smiled faintly. "It seems this table belongs to us now." "I don't think it does," she replied, trying to sound firm. He looked amused. "Then why are you here again?" She blinked. "Because I always come here." "Exactly," he said softly. "And so do I." There was something strange about the way he said it, like he believed the universe had planned it that way. "I didn't see you before yesterday." She said. "You didn't notice," he corrected. She frowned. "Why would I notice you?" "Because I've been noticing you," he said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. The words made her stomach tighten. She didn't know whether to feel flattered or frightened. "You don't even know me." He leaned forward slightly. "I know enough." She wanted to ask what that meant, but she was afraid of the answer. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Did you sleep well?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes," she said. "Good," he replied, sipping his coffee. "You looked tired yesterday." She blinked. "You remember how I looked?" He smiled. "I remember everything." His calmness unsettled her. He wasn't threatening, not exactly, but there was something about him that made her feel like she was standing too close to a storm. Finally, she said softly, "You shouldn't say things like what you said yesterday. It's not normal." He looked at her unbothered. "You mean calling you my wife?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, that." He tilted his head. "It made you think, didn't it?" "It made me uncomfortable," she said. He nodded almost respectfully. "That's fair. But it's better than being invisible." Elena frowned. "Why are you saying this to me?" "What do you want?" He studied her for a long moment before answering. "To protect you," she stared at him. "Protect me? From what?" He didn't reply right away. His eyes drifted toward the cafe window, as if he were watching for something outside. Then he said quietly, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." She shook her head. "Try me." He smiled faintly. "Not today." For the rest of their silent coffee, Elena kept glancing at him. He didn't talk much, but there was something oddly peaceful about his presence. Unsettling, yet strangely grounding. When he finally stood to leave, he nodded to her politely. "Same time tomorrow," he said, as if it were a promise. She wanted to protest, but he was already gone. That night, she lay in bed thinking about him. She didn't want to, but her mind kept going back to his voice, his calmness, the quiet certainty in the way he spoke. She told herself it was just curiosity. Nothing more. The next morning, she told herself she wouldn't go to the cafe. She'd buy coffee somewhere else, maybe near her office. But when she got to the corner, her feet stopped. Through the cafe window, she saw him sitting there in her usual seat, drinking his coffee slowly. She almost turned around. Almost. But something stronger than fear pulled her forward. When she walked in, he stood slightly, just enough to acknowledge her, then gestured to the chair across from him. She sighed and sat down. "You really don't give up, do you?" "Should I?" He asked simply. "Maybe," she said. "Most people would." "I'm not most people," he said. That much was clear. The waitress brought her cappuccino and quickly disappeared. Elena noticed how the other customers avoided looking at their table. Even the owner seemed tense. Finally, she asked, "Who are you, really?" He took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Someone who keeps promises." "What kind of promise?" "One made a long time ago," he said. "Before you knew who I was," she shook her head. "You're not making any sense." He smiled faintly. "You don't need to understand everything right away. You just need to trust that you're safe." "Safe from what?" He didn't answer directly. "You're being watched," he said quietly. Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "Not by me," he added quickly. "By others. People who don't have your best interests at heart." Elena's hands tightened around her cup. "You're scaring me." "I'm warning you," he said gently. "That's different." She looked at him carefully. His face was calm, but his eyes weren't. They were watchful, serious, almost sad. "Why would anyone be watching me?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then said, "Because of who your father was." Her breath caught. "My father? He was a teacher." The man shook his head slightly. "To you, yes. To others, something more." Elena didn't know what to say. "You knew him?" He nodded once. "A long time ago. He helped me when no one else would. I owe him more than I can repay." She stared at him. "And that's why you said," he interrupted gently, "that you're my wife?" "Yes, it wasn't meant to scare you. It was meant to protect you." "Protect me how?" "In my world, those words mean something. They make people stay away. They mean you're under my protection. No one touches you, no one follows you, no one asks questions." Elena leaned back, trying to process everything. "That sounds crazy, maybe," he said. "But it's also real." She rubbed her temples. "You're talking like you're part of something dangerous." He smiled slightly. "Let's just say my world is different from yours." For a moment they sat in silence. Then softly he added, "I didn't mean to frighten you, but I can't undo what's already been said. It's done." Elena didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to walk away and never come back. Another part of her, the part that had been lonely for too long, wanted to believe that someone actually cared enough to watch over her. When she looked up, he was already standing. "You'll understand soon," he said quietly. "Until then, just live your days. Drink your coffee. Pretend everything is normal." Then he left as calmly as he had come. Elena sat there for a long time, staring at his empty cup. The waitress came over and whispered, "You should stay away from him." Elena looked up. "Who is he?" The waitress shook her head. "Someone powerful. Someone you don't say no to." That night, Elena couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Not angry, not cruel, just certain. She didn't know it yet, but from that day on, her life would start to change in quiet ways. People she didn't recognize would look at her on the street. She'd hear footsteps behind her that stopped when she turned around. And somewhere, always watching, would be the man who had sat across from her and claimed her life with a single, quiet sentence. Days turned into weeks, and her quiet life no longer felt the same. Nothing around her had really changed. The same streets, the same people, the same small apartment with its half-read books and cold coffee cups, but she had changed. She noticed things now. The man by the flower shop who stood there a little too long. The same dark car that sometimes appeared on the corner when she left work. The way her phone battery drained faster than it used to. She told herself she was imagining it. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was just the aftertaste of fear left behind by that strange man who had entered her life so suddenly. But deep down, she knew better. He had said, "You're being watched," and now she could feel it. At first, she didn't see him again. Days passed, then a week, then two. She thought maybe he was gone for good. She started to relax again, even smiled a little more at work. But the feeling never fully left her. Then one evening, as she left the office late, she saw him again. He was standing across the street, dressed in dark clothes, one hand in his coat pocket. He didn't move, didn't call out. He just stood there watching her quietly. She froze for a second, unsure whether to run or walk. Finally, she crossed the street slowly. "You're following me," she said. "I'm keeping my promise," he replied calmly. "I didn't ask you to," she said. He nodded once. "No, but I gave my word to someone who did." Her eyes narrowed. "My father," he nodded again. She sighed. "You said that before, but my father was a teacher. He didn't make promises with men like you." A faint smile crossed his lips. "You think you knew everything about him?" That question stayed with her even after he was gone. The next morning, he was at the cafe before she arrived. The table was already waiting, her cappuccino placed neatly on her side, black coffee on his. "You're early," she said as she sat down. "I don't like being late," he said, "especially when it comes to something important." She looked at him, trying to read his face. "Why me?" He took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Because your father once saved my life." Her breath caught. "What?" "It was many years ago," he said quietly. "Before you were born. I was not a good man and I had made many enemies. One night someone came for me. I was badly hurt. Your father found me near the old docks, bleeding. He could have walked away, but he didn't. He helped me. He took me to safety." She stared at him. trying to connect that story with the man she remembered. My father never talked about that. Because he didn't want you near my world, the man said softly. He made me promise something, that if anything ever happened to him, I'd protect you. No matter what. Her voice trembled slightly. My father died of a heart attack, he nodded. I know. And when I found out, I kept my word. Elena sat back in silence, her fingers tight around her cup. So that's why you've been watching me? Yes, he said simply, from a distance. Until it wasn't enough. What do you mean? He looked at her carefully. Someone else started watching too. Her stomach dropped. Whoa. Oh, he didn't answer directly. People who wanted to use you. To get to me. When I realized that, I needed to make it clear you weren't alone. So I claimed you. She shook her head slowly. That's not normal. No, he said softly. But it's how things work in my world. She sighed deeply. You keep saying that, your world. What does that even mean? He smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. It means I do things that don't make sense in the light. It means I have power, but I've paid for it with peace. And now you're caught in that shadow because of a promise I made long ago. She didn't know what to say. He continued. I didn't come to change your life, Elena. I came to make sure it continues, quietly, safely. Even if you never understand how much danger you are in. She swallowed. Danger from who? He looked out the window, his jaw tightening. From people who don't forgive. Old debts. Old grudges, her voice softened. So I'm just part of that. He met her eyes. No. You're the only part that matters now. The silence that followed felt heavy. She wanted to believe him. But everything about him, his calmness, his power, the way the whole cafe seemed to go quiet when he spoke, made her heart race with confusion. Finally, she said softly, you can't protect me by pretending I'm your wife. He smiled faintly. It worked, didn't it? You're still here. No one's touched you. That doesn't make it right, she whispered. No, he said. But it makes it real. For the next few days, she tried to go back to normal. She went to work, talked to her colleagues, and even met an old friend for lunch. But everywhere she went, she caught small signs that he wasn't far. A black car parked near her building. A man reading a newspaper too long outside her office. A text from an unknown number. Go straight home tonight. And every time she turned, somewhere in the distance, she caught a glimpse of him, always calm, always watching, as if he was part of the air itself. At first, she wanted to be angry, but one night that changed. It happened on her way home. She had stayed late at work again, lost in her tasks, trying to forget all the strange tension in her life. When she finally left, the streets were nearly empty. She took the subway as usual and sat quietly holding her bag close. At one stop, a man bumped into her hard. She mumbled, "It's fine," and looked away. But then she noticed. Her bag felt lighter. She turned, but the man was already gone, running out of the train just as the doors closed. Her wallet, her phone, everything was in that bag. Her heart raced. Panic set in. She was trapped between stations with no way to call for help. When the train stopped at the next platform, she stepped out quickly, trying to calm herself. She stood near the exit, not knowing what to do next. And that's when she saw him. He was standing by the ticket gate, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same quiet certainty. When their eyes met, she felt her panic melt into confusion. How did you... He didn't let her finish. He nodded toward the stairs. You're safe now, he said softly. And somehow she believed him. Later that night, when she finally got home, she found her bag waiting at her doorstep. Everything inside untouched. No note, no explanation. She knew he had done it. That was the night her fear changed into something else. Not trust, not exactly, but a strange sense of connection. Like he had quietly stepped into the empty space her father once filled. Protective, distant, but always there. Days turned into another week. She still didn't know his full name or what he really did. But she started to see him differently, not just as a man from a darker world, but as someone carrying a heavy promise he refused to break. One morning, when she walked into the cafe, she found him already waiting as always. But this time he looked tired, his usually sharp expression softened by something she hadn't seen before. You look different, she said quietly. He smiled faintly. Maybe I slept less. She hesitated, then said, You don't have to keep doing this. Watching me. Protecting me. You've done enough. He shook his head. It doesn't work like that. It should, she said softly. People can move on. He looked down at his cup. Some promises don't end even when we want them to. She didn't know what to say, so she just sat there, watching the man who had somehow become part of her days. A mystery she hadn't asked for, but one she couldn't ignore anymore. Outside, the morning sunlight fell through the window, touching both their cups. She noticed his hand resting near hers, not close enough to touch, but not far either. For a moment it felt peaceful, like maybe two worlds could meet without breaking each other. Then, as quietly as he came, he stood up. "I'll see you soon," he said, and even though she didn't know when or where, she believed him. That night she couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was curiosity, and something she didn't want to name yet. The days grew quieter after that. She still went to work, still took her morning walks, still visited the cafe where everything had started. But now something had changed. It wasn't just her routine anymore. It was the way the world seemed to move around her. People treated her differently. The owner of the cafe smiled more carefully, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. The barista stopped asking questions. Even the neighbors in her building, who used to nod politely in the hallway, now greeted her with nervous glances before walking quickly away. She didn't understand it at first. But then she began to realize it wasn't her they were afraid of. It was him. The man who had walked into her life and claimed her with a sentence that still echoed in her mind. From this sip, you're my wife. He hadn't said those words again, but they lingered between them whenever they met. She saw him almost every day now, sometimes at the cafe, sometimes waiting across the street from her office, sometimes sitting in his car near her apartment late at night. He never intruded, never demanded her time. But he was always there, watching quietly, like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. At first it frightened her, but then slowly it began to feel like something else. Not love, not friendship, but a strange, unspoken connection that neither of them fully understood. One evening, she decided to ask him for the truth. They met at the cafe, just like always. The same corner table, the same coffee cups, the same quiet hum of music that filled the air between them. She waited until he had taken his first sip before speaking. "You said my father helped you once." He nodded. "Yes, and that you made a promise to protect me." He nodded again. She leaned forward. "But there's more to it, isn't there?" He looked at her carefully, his dark eyes steady. "What makes you think that?" "Because people don't act this way just to repay a favor. They don't follow someone, protect them, claim them in public unless something deeper is behind it." He didn't answer right away. He set his cup down slowly, the porcelain making a soft sound against the table. "Your father was not just a teacher," he said quietly. Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "He had another life," he said. "One you never saw. He worked with people like me, people who lived by rules that never made it into the light." She shook her head. "That can't be true. My father hated violence. He was gentle." "I know," the man said softly. "That's what made him different. That's why he survived for so long. He helped people like me when no one else would. He didn't use a weapon, he used kindness. He had influence where it mattered. And when he died, there were still debts tied to his name. Some were grateful, others were not." Elena's voice trembled. "You mean someone wanted to hurt me because of him?" He nodded slowly. "There were people who thought hurting you would settle an old score. That's why I stepped in before they could." She stared at him, unable to speak. "I didn't tell you sooner," he continued, "because I wanted to keep you out of that world. But when I saw the way things were turning, I had no choice. Declaring you under my protection was the only way to keep them away." She looked down at her hands, unsure what to feel. "You made it sound like I belonged to you." "In my world," he said, his tone gentle, "words like that are not about belonging. They're about safety. When I said you were my wife, I was making it known that you were untouchable, that anyone who tried to come near you would answer to me." She was quiet for a long time. The cafe had emptied a little, and the light outside had turned golden. "You could have just told me," she said softly. He gave a faint smile. "Would you have believed me?" She sighed. "Probably not," he nodded. "Then I did what I had to do." They sat in silence after that. She could hear the clock ticking behind the counter, the faint sound of a spoon stirring in someone's cup, the quiet hum of the coffee machine. Everything felt still, as if time itself had stopped to listen. Finally, she asked, "So what happens now? Do I just keep pretending nothing's wrong?" He looked at her for a moment, then said, "You live your life. You work, you smile, you walk in the sunlight. That's what your father would have wanted. Let me worry about everything else." She studied his face. There was something tired in his eyes, something that went beyond sleepless nights or stress. It was the kind of tired that came from caring too much for too long. "Who protects you?" she asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "No one," he said. "That's not how my life works." She didn't reply. But a small part of her, the part that used to believe people could be saved, wished she could do something for him. That night when she got home, she thought about her father for a long time. She remembered his calm voice, his quiet wisdom, the way he always told her that goodness could exist even in dark places. Maybe that's what he had seen in the man who now watched over her. The next morning, when she walked into the cafe, the man was already there as usual, but something was different this time. He looked uneasy, distracted. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "There's been talk," he said quietly. "People are questioning why I've taken such an interest in you. They think it's weakness." "Why would they care?" she asked. "Because power attracts attention," he said. "And when you protect someone outside that world, it creates tension." Her stomach tightened. "Does that mean I'm in danger again?" He shook his head. "Not while I'm here." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the way he said it made her stop. There was finality in his voice, like he was preparing for something she didn't understand yet. They drank their coffee in silence. When he stood to leave, he placed an envelope on the table. "What's this?" she asked. "Something your father left behind," he said. "I kept it safe until I knew you were ready to see it." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, old, creased, and slightly faded. It began simply, "My dear daughter." She read the rest quietly, her eyes filling as she reached the end. Her father's words were full of love, full of warnings she had never understood before, about trust, about people who lived in shadows, about a man who might one day find her when she least expected it. When she looked up, the man was gone. She ran outside, but the street was empty. Only the faint sound of traffic echoed in the distance. She clutched the letter to her chest and walked home slowly, her mind spinning. That night she sat by the window, reading her father's letter again and again until she knew every word by heart. It was then she realized that her father had planned this. Not the fear, not the confusion, but the protection. He had trusted this man with her life because he knew he would keep his word. She didn't know what would happen next, but something inside her shifted. The fear that had once held her hostage began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. The next morning she went to the cafe early. She waited for him, but he didn't come. She waited again the next day and the one after that. Still nothing. Days turned into a week. The seat across from her stayed empty, and the air felt heavier without him there. But she noticed something. The black car was still parked down the street, and sometimes, when she looked closely enough, she thought she saw a shadow move behind the tinted glass. He was still there, watching, protecting, keeping his promise. She smiled softly and lifted her cup, whispering to herself, "I hope you're drinking your coffee too." And though she couldn't hear him, she felt the quiet answer in the stillness around her, as if somewhere he was doing exactly that. The cafe felt different that morning. The air was cooler, and the usual hum of people talking sounded distant, like a song fading in another room. She sat at her usual table, her hands wrapped around the warm cup of coffee she had ordered out of habit. He had not come for days, maybe weeks. She had stopped counting. At first, the quiet had been a relief. No shadow across the street, no car parked near her building, no one watching her from the corner of the cafe. But after a while, the silence had become too big. It followed her everywhere, pressing against her thoughts like a secret she didn't want to keep. She missed him. She didn't want to, but she did. Sometimes she caught herself looking toward the door, hoping he would appear again, calm and unreadable, ready to sit across from her like nothing had ever changed. But he never did. One afternoon, as she left work, she found a small note tucked under the windshield of her car. It was written in the same steady handwriting she had seen on the envelope he once gave her. The note said only 3 words, "Walk without fear." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her bag. It wasn't goodbye. It was something else. A quiet message from someone who had decided to step out of her world to let her live in peace. That night, she made tea instead of coffee and sat by her window. The city lights looked softer than usual, blurred by the fog rolling in. She thought about the strange way life could turn, how one morning a stranger could walk into your world and change everything, not with love or anger, but with purpose. She had never asked for protection. She had never asked for his presence. But somehow she couldn't imagine her life without the mark he had left behind. Days turned into weeks. The fear that had once filled her heart was gone, replaced by something new: strength. She began to travel to new parts of the city. She spoke more at work. She smiled again. And though she still sat alone at the cafe, she no longer felt lonely. One morning, while walking to the train, she noticed a familiar figure standing by a bookstore across the street. He wasn't in his usual dark suit, just a simple coat and scarf. He looked like any other man out for coffee, but she knew it was him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile that reached his eyes, and gave a faint nod before walking away. She didn't call out to him. She didn't follow. Something inside her told her it was enough just to know he was alive, that he was still there somewhere, living quietly in the same city, keeping his promise from a distance. Weeks later, the cafe owner placed a small package on her table as she was finishing her drink. "Someone left this for you," he said softly. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single silver ring, simple, without stones or decoration, and a folded piece of paper that said, "This is not a claim. It's a thank you for reminding me what peace looks like." She traced the ring with her fingers, feeling a strange calm settle over her. He wasn't coming back, not the way he once had, but that was okay. He had given her something better than protection. He had given her her own strength back. That evening, she went home and placed the ring beside her father's letter. Then she sat by the window again, sipping coffee and watching the lights of the city blink like distant stars. Time moved on. The seasons changed. People came and went, but the story didn't end there. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, she returned to the cafe. The staff still recognized her. Her cup was ready before she even ordered. She took her usual seat and smiled to herself. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for anyone. She was just there, living, breathing, at peace. But then the door opened. The sound of footsteps crossed the floor, steady and slow. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Something in her heart already knew. He sat down across from her just as he had the very first day. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, studying her face as if trying to read how much time had changed her. She smiled faintly. "You're late," she said. His lips curved into the smallest smile. "I didn't think you'd still come here." "I never stopped," she said. He looked at her cup. "Same order?" She nodded. "Always." He leaned back slightly, the old calm returning to his face. "You look different," he said after a moment. "I feel different," she replied. "You were right. I learned to walk without fear." He lowered his eyes for a second, then said quietly, "Then I kept my promise." She took a sip of her coffee, the warmth filling her chest. "Why did you come back?" He hesitated. "Because I realized something," he said. "Protection is easy. Letting go is hard. But sometimes you can't really let go until you know the person you care about is free." She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "I'm free now." He nodded. "I can see that." They sat there quietly for a while. Outside, the sun spilled across the street, catching the edge of the window and lighting their table with a soft golden glow. After a moment, she spoke again. "When you first said those words about the coffee and being your wife, I thought you were trying to control me." He smiled faintly. "You had every reason to think that. But now I know you were just trying to keep a promise," she continued. "You weren't claiming me. You were saving me." He looked at her gently. "It wasn't just saving you. It was saving a part of myself, too." The silence that followed didn't feel heavy. It felt calm, full of unspoken understanding. After a while, she lifted her cup, looked into his eyes, and said quietly, "From this sip, maybe now it's my choice." For the first time, he laughed softly, the sound warm and real. "Then I'll take that as a good sign," he said. They sat together until the cafe began to fill again with noise. People coming and going, cups clinking, spoons stirring. The world kept moving around them, but for that brief moment it felt like time had paused again, just like it had the first day they met. When they finally stood, he reached for his coat. "Will I see you again?" he asked. She smiled. "You might, but if you don't, know that I'm all right." He nodded, his expression soft but certain. "That's all I ever wanted." He turned to leave, and for a moment she thought about stopping him, asking him to stay, to share one more cup, one more conversation. But she didn't. Some stories don't end with people walking off together. Some end with each two souls finally finding peace, separately, but side by side in the same world. As he stepped out of the cafe, sunlight caught his figure for a moment before he disappeared into the crowd. She watched the door close behind him, then looked down at her cup, smiling quietly. The barista came over. "Same as always?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, same as always." And as she took another sip, she thought about all the mornings that had led to this one, every quiet moment, every look, every word that had shaped the strange, beautiful connection between them. It had started with a single cup of coffee, a sentence that had felt like a curse and a man she didn't understand. But in the end, it had become something else entirely. A reminder that sometimes protection is another form of love, and love itself doesn't always need to be spoken aloud. She looked out the window at the people passing by, strangers going about their lives, each carrying their own untold story. She smiled again, finished her drink, and whispered softly, "Thank you." And somewhere, maybe not far away, the man who had once declared her his wife over a sip of coffee paused for a moment, as if he had heard her voice through the hum of the city, and smiled too.